So, part of the reason that we wanted to do this is to kind of advertise Platypus to, new people. We're just kind of getting situated on the University of Melbourne properly, finally, thanks to the good work of other people, not me, but good work of people in that chapter. And what I really want to kind of spell out is this is to kind of advertise Platypus a little bit, and it's not a history lecture by any means. I'm not a trained historian, and it's a kind of outline of a historical problematic that Platypus seeks to situate. But importantly, we're not just a reading group. We have we host public fora. Panels are important. It's kind of the main thing we've done as a Melbourne chapter. Hosted a bunch of, I think, quite interesting, successful, some less so perhaps, depending on what your metrics are, but all very interesting discussions, and hosting the discussion that wouldn't happen otherwise on the left. It really wouldn't happen otherwise on the left if not for us, and getting people in the room to elaborate on their historical experience. It's certainly been a bit of an eye-opener for me, particularly if we can get a generational dialogue going. That's always interesting, and it's good to get the new leftists, and have managed to get a bunch of the new leftists before they kick the bucket, and they can talk about their generational experience, and trying to get them to not hold their tongues. I think a lot of the time, older people they want to be very generous to young people, or else maybe even nervous around them, but we want to have and foster an environment of intellectual curiosity and openness, and where no questions are off the table. So with that all in mind, I'll say the Platypus Affiliated Society organizes reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old, the 1920s and 30s, new 1960s and 70s, and post-political 1980s and 90s left for the possibility of emancipatory politics today. Okay, now, it's not so long, this thing, my teaching today, and feel free to jump in with questions or comments, but let's have a look. So I'd like to start with a quote from Adam Smith, published in 1776. From his Wealth of Nations. Smith writes, "Every species of animals naturally multiplies in proportion to the means of their subsistence, and no species can ever multiply beyond it. But in civilized society, it is only among the inferior ranks of people that the scantiness of subsistence can set limits to the further multiplication of the human species, and it can do so in no other way than by destroying a great part of the children which their fruitful marriages produce. The liberal reward of labour, by enabling them to provide better for their children, and consequently to bring up a greater number, naturally tends to widen and extend those limits. It deserves to be remarked too, that it necessarily does this as nearly as possible in the proportion which the demands of labour requires. If this demand is continually increasing, the reward of labour must necessarily encourage in such a manner the continual increasing demand by a continually increasing population. If the reward should at any time be less than what was requisite for this purpose, the deficiency of hand would soon raise it. And if it should at any time be more, their excessive multiplication would soon lower it to its necessary rate. The market would be so much understocked with labour in the one case, and so much overstocked in the other, as would soon force back its price to that proper rate which the circumstances of the society required. It is in this manner that the demand for men, like that of any other commodity, necessarily regulates the production of men, quickens when it goes on too slowly, and stops it when it advances too fast. To our neoliberal, or perhaps anti-neoliberal eyes here, Smith appears to be describing and affirming the proper functioning of the capitalist market. Let us, however, problematize this widespread reading. Smith was, in the context of the crisis of the epochal English Revolution, advocating, you could say the epochal crisis of the English Revolution, probably a better way to say that, advocating for the rights of the commodity, that is, the freedom of labor, which held the potential to revolutionize the whole world and expand the burgeoning realm of freedom. And I'm going to elaborate on what I'm talking about here, so bear with me. Adam Smith inherited the critical spirit of John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who advocated for property in oneself, or to put it another way, for the society of free labor, as a great potential that promised to unleash the progress of human civilization in new and open-ended ways. Of course, Rousseau's a curious figure here. To lump him in with Locke in that way is maybe a strange one, because Rousseau, he has a very what you could take as a kind of awareness of civilization, or else he really is the kind of thought, he produces that kind of idea that that Kant will later call, glittering misery. If civilization doesn't live up to its potentials, it could produce, it could be a hollow progress. Don't have so much faith in this kind of machine of the modern world that you guys are building, because it could result in a devastation of its own potential, if you like. And it's important because, as we'll come round to the revolution for society, the bourgeois revolution, so the French and American revolutions, they're not so much a revolution against feudalism and to start bourgeois society. Bourgeois society has already been going on for hundreds of years, and they're trying to preserve and salvage the great things about, say, the English Revolution, the great things about what James Vaughan, the historian James Vaughan, and a veteran member of Platypus, calls the Empire of Liberty. So there's a kind of what I'm trying to get at here is there's a preservation and a kind of furthering by the time that the revolution for society kind of kicks off. So they advocated for property in oneself as a great potential that's going to unleash society in new and open-ended ways. The emergent society, with its self-expanding division of labor, seemed to potentially doom slavery once and for all. Not just the slavery of man bound to a master, but of the slavery of mankind to the ebbs and flows of the natural world. The old social forms were being superseded by a freedom that was casting its judgment back on the whole of history as a question of progress in freedom. What do I mean by old social forms? Well, self-avowed Marxists are fond of declaiming the famous opening lines from Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. This is a critical judgment with a layered meaning. It is firstly the proposition that from the vantage point of the crisis of bourgeois society in the mid-19th century, all history appears as the history of class struggles. This is the flip side of the speculative proposition of socialism, that is the self-abolition of modern class society on its own basis. Moreover, as veteran Platypus member and historian Spencer Leonard has pointed out, for the Enlightenment radicals such as Adam Smith, the establishment of a class society was an advance over pre-modern societies, which were often based on arbitrary privilege. For example, the highly personalized social relations of feudalism or patriarchal forms of slavery weren't any more conducive to self-reflection than the more brutal forms of slavery used in, say, commodity extraction or, public works in the ancient world. As Leonard writes, taking up Adam Smith, in bourgeois society, all wealth is originally labor, from which, after the claims arising from the accumulation of stock and the appropriation of land are deducted as profits and rents, those who expect, in addition, say, personal deference or sexual favors, fail to recognize and must again be made to understand that this is a class society. The general will of bourgeois society, to which political forms struggled to keep pace, found expression not just in the ultimate subordination of politics to this emergent freedom of labor, but in a world historical revolutionizing of culture, art, religion, science, education, technology, and perhaps most importantly for our purposes today, a new historical self-understanding inextricably bound up to the revolution in philosophy. The Enlightenment, so the different stages to the Enlightenment, but I'll just say the Enlightenment in general, was particularly the kind of high Enlightenment that leads into the French and American Revolution, or thereabouts, was a culmination of this emergent self-understanding. Importantly, the revolutionary content of the Enlightenment wasn't an affirmation of the trajectory of society, but a critique of this potential. And that's what I kind of tried to say about Rousseau before. Critique of this potential. As Immanuel Kant would stress, he was living in an age of enlightenment, not an enlightened age. Freedom had become an urgent task, which was to be both protected and furthered by the evolving social cooperation of society. In this new social totality, the future was no longer bound by the past, but promised a seemingly limitless potential. Thomas Jefferson's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were ideals our revolutionary society ought to aspire to. We'll return to this later because it's an interesting one. Returning then to the Kantian task of a perfectly just civic constitution, let us hear from another American revolutionary, Thomas Paine, in his famous pamphlet, Common Sense. Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even if in its best state, is but a necessary evil, in its worst state, an intolerable one. For when we suffer, or are exposed to the same miseries by a government, which we might expect in a country without government, our calamity is heightened by reflecting that we furnish the means by which we suffer. And this idea of kind of self-discipline, or the society capable of kind of disciplining itself even to its own crisis, is something that we'll come back to, because it's a curious one. Capitalism, as we'll discuss, it's kind of constituted from below, and that's an interesting way of framing it. If you just took the kind of propagandistic rhetoric at face value of even the kind of high Marxist period, pamphleteering and stuff from that time, you might be misled into thinking that the bourgeois epoch was just a changing of the guard of the ruling class or something like that. That's not how historical Marxism understood it. I've got into this, but we'll elaborate a little bit on what I mean by the revolution of society as a bourgeois epoch and the revolution for society that I've kind of stolen from James Vaughan. While the bourgeois epoch had emerged over several hundred years, the political revolution came at the tail end of this process, inaugurated by things like the Dutch Revolt, and the War of Independence, and the English Civil War and the English Revolution of the 17th century, and a century later deepened in profound ways by the American and French revolutions and their global ramifications. It is important here, and I'll stress the point again, the revolution came at the end of the political revolution came at the end of the bourgeois revolutionary epoch. So the political revolution came at the end. So, as I said, that's a revolution for society, emerged from the revolution of society. So the revolution of society, what's that? Well, it emerged from, say, the 15th century or perhaps earlier, with the Age of Discovery, the Renaissance, and the Reformation, kind of crisis in Christianity and reform of Christianity, which obviously affects Catholicism and Protestantism, and it affects the kind of it falls in line and kind of shows it's subordinated, if you like, to modernity. Christianity becomes kind of subordinated to modernity, and might say that it actually is fulfilled in kind of profound ways through kind of liberal society, if you like. We can discuss it a little bit later if you guys want, but it's an interesting one. No one would call the bourgeois epoch a time of peace, by any means. But as Hegel would later note, happy periods are often blank pages in history. As to say, war itself had become pregnant with its own critique, one that promised to supersede the apparent need for war. What then of this political revolution? How was the social content of the bourgeois epoch to be expressed through political revolution? As English Marxist Belfort Bax wrote in a short history of the French Revolution in 1890, the question of politics had already been signaled by the rise of absolutism. To understand the position of affairs, it is necessary to remember that since the collapse of feudalism as a living political order, with its quarrels between the titular king and his more or less nominally vassal barons, power had been concentrated more and more in royal hands, while nationalities had become definitely fixed. And if you guys look at what I just mentioned there, that Belfort Bax short history of the French Revolution, if you read that and then read what I've been saying here, you'd say, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? This guy's tied up with the kind of Second International, and he says the French Revolution was a proletarian revolution. Johnny, so what is this? Well, how are you saying that? And I will say that the proletariat comes later as a historical actor. How am I saying that the French Revolution, the revolt of the Third Estate, is not a proletarian revolution when someone like Belfort Bax is saying that it is? Well, read it with the eyes in which it was intended. And there's a great teach-in by a man in Platypus from England called Ephraim Karlbach on Chartism and Marxism, and you can look that up on YouTube. And he really gets into what someone like Belfort Bax is trying to do, which is, and it's there on the page, you'll see this whole apparently historical account of the French Revolution. And at the end of the chapters, it'll be like, and this is what has gone missing with the kind of bureaucratic excrescence of the trade unions in our country. The English socialist movement is too beholden and to these trade unions. It's not the be-all and end-all of socialism, etc., etc. So he's addressing a specific object of critique. That's how he's using the French Revolution. That's how he's using it. He's fashioning a history after the fact, as a critique of the present. He's looking for the needs of the present. Okay, so we've got to be careful about who and who is not writing history, or at least how are people using history. So, I mean, people sometimes say about Donald Trump, they say, take him seriously, his supporters. They'll say, take him seriously, don't take him literally. And I think, maybe it's a little bit of a good rule of thumb for reading some of these histories that emerge with the Second International Marxism. Likewise, with something I've read recently too that could fit in with this is written by an Irish member of the Second International, kind of leader of the Irish socialist movement. James Connolly writes Labour in Irish History. And that too has to be understood in the context of his critique, which is he's critiquing basically Irish nationalism. He's saying, look, we need to be careful that we don't swamp the potential that we have here with socialism. Really, the question isn't. He raises the whole critique of national self-determination becoming an end in itself rather than a means to an end, and all that sort of thing. So just keep that in mind, and read these things definitely, but just keep that kind of critical consciousness, or at least I hope you can read them. I feel like Platypus has taught me to read a little bit more open-mindedly, and I think that's a helpful way to address things like that. So if we were to conflate, so returning to it, what is Belford Back saying? He's saying that the political question had already been raised by absolutism. Now, if one were to conflate democracy with liberalism, absolutism might seem at odds with the rights of the commodity. Indeed, from the writings of the Enlightenment radicals, we might infer an indifference to the precise form of the sovereign. I think more accurately, for the bourgeois revolutionaries, the protection of the rule of man by man wasn't a state of affairs to be realized, but was rather an ongoing task. The point was that the state was to be subordinated to the rights and cooperation of civil society. A cooperation, as Adam Smith clarified, that was not an appeal to some charitable instinct, but rather to the self-interest of the producers themselves. And I'll quote from Kant here from his Project for a Universal History. The highest purpose of nature, which is the development of all the capacities which can be achieved by mankind, is attainable only in society, and more specifically in the society with the greatest freedom. Such a society is one which there is mutual opposition among the members, together with the most exact definition of freedom and fixing of its limits, so that it may be consistent with the freedom of others. Nature demands that humankind should itself achieve this goal like all its other destined goals. Thus, a society in which freedom under external laws is associated in the highest degree with irresistible power, that is, a perfectly just civic constitution, is the highest problem nature assigns to the human race. For nature can achieve her other purposes for mankind only upon the solution and completion of this assignment. So you have a concept in there which is an unsocial sociability, the Kantian concept. That it's not through appeals to people's better nature or something like that that we exist in this commercial society, but rather you're appealing to the self-interest of, as Adam Smith says, of the butcher and the baker. That it's through their self-interest that there's a whole unleashing of our potentials, a whole unleashing of this social totality just through the small steps to and from work, the interactions that we have in society is kind of has unintended consequences beyond itself. Okay, now Eric Hobsbawm, famous historian, Marxist historian, famous figure in the 20th century, he wrote in 1962 that the legacy of the French Revolution in particular is written in the fungibility of political forms. Indeed, the French state ran the gamut from the dynamic and crisis-ridden forms of the revolution, which ultimately resolved into the Napoleonic Empire, to the restored Bourbon monarchy of 1830, to the short-lived republic following 1848, to the Bonaparte III's 1952 empire, which eventually fell with the Franco-Prussian War. Now, Hannah Arendt, a conservative critic of Marxism, would write in 1963 that the crucible on which historical Marxism had founded was its neglect of the American Revolution, and this, we'll get into this, but this apparent antinomy, she says, they've neglected the American Revolution in favor of the French Revolution. And as we'll discuss, this apparent antinomy between the French and American Revolution, completely alien to the historical actors of the bourgeois revolution, you might say that, Thomas Jefferson and not that Alexander Hamilton, we can get into that, I guess, but it's not to say the French Revolution wasn't consequential for America. It's not even, it's not even really this idea, they're just using, and I'm just using these things as kind of thought figures. The way that Hobsbawm and Hannah Arendt are using them it would be alien to the historical actors. I think that's accurate to say. What it really is the frozen antinomy of political and social action. That's what's happened there. There's a kind of frozen antinomy between the political and the social, and it's probably appropriate, thinking about when those books are written in the mid-20th century, because it does seem by that stage that earlier questions, that kind of the dynamic early history of Marxism has become kind of hardened and ossified by that time, you could argue. This apparent antinomy between political and social action was once a living question posed by the self-activity of the workers' movement. In the 1820s, we saw the rise of utopian socialism, famously through the writings of Charles Fourier and Saint-Simon. And yet the political subject of their futuristic visions wouldn't emerge until the kind of 1830s, through what Hobsbawm calls one of the most radical innovations in politics hitherto experienced in modernity, the rise of the class struggle, the very existence of which changed the character of the political task. Now, returning for a moment to the criticism of modern revolution as inadequately grasping its historical specificity. This is not alien to Marxism, or even, of course, the liberal tradition it critically inherited. In the republishing of the Manifesto in 1888, Engels had footnoted the famous line on the class character of all hitherto existing society with a brief comment on the haunting spectre of primitive communism that had gained traction in the popular consciousness of the time. As we will further discuss, and as Engels himself elucidated, the epochal character of class society had held a potential that non-class societies didn't and could not hold. Excuse me. To help us grasp this problem, let us briefly meditate on the distinction between political and civil rights, or between society and the state, questions that have plagued so much of Marxist thought, especially in the wake of its failure. Now, in 1819, Benjamin Constant critiqued the French Revolution for not recognizing modern liberty as distinct from the liberty of the ancients. He celebrated the revolution in spite of its excesses, and yet Constant was at pains to point out that property, for us moderns, had become a social relation, whereas for the ancients it was a right of ownership. For example, in Plato's Republic, the best constituted states had settled accounts with the question of who owns what via a just distribution of power, where every man understood and excelled in his proper place. Relatedly, the community of property of the ancients, conditioned by the Spartan distrust of excess or even primitive communism, seemed to color the political collectivism of the French Revolution in its crisis. For Constant, this was a happy problem, in that it provided an occasion for both self-reflection and clarification. And here let's return to that great bourgeois radical of both the French and American revolutions, Thomas Jefferson, who updated John Locke's Life, Liberty and Property to Life, Liberty and the Pursuit of Happiness. That is to say, property had become but a means to an end towards the expansion of freedom. And I'll just do a quick plug again, seeing as I'm promoting Platypus today. One of the kind of most profound things I ever got out of Platypus, and one of the things I found most interesting, really rocked my world, is an American Revolution series. There's an American Revolution series where it has, it's James Vaughan, Chris Catrone, Pam Nagalis, and Spencer Leonard, and Reed Cutlass. I think that's all of them. And they kind of go through kind of stages and kind of crisis of bourgeois society and capitalism through the kind of lens of the evolving American Revolution, which I say really is the world revolution. They say, the revolution had a country, it was America, not that a country that had a revolution. You know what I mean? It's all our revolution, and it's important to note, I think, particularly with the Thomas Jefferson point here, this pursuit of happiness. Why do I like it so much? I like Chris Catrone in that lecture series says that there's a kind of mysterious quality to the pursuit of happiness. So it's gone from life, liberty, and property. That's a John Locke, it's a revolutionary ideal of the English Revolution. John Locke, a century before, was a champion of the English Revolution. And it's a curious one because, as we'll discuss, the property in oneself, we kind of lose the property in oneself in the 19th century. Proletariat becomes propertyless because they are rendered superfluous through the very process that they've helped bring about. But that's not just a negation of bourgeois ideal, but in fact, if property is just a means to an end, then it really does seem that you could make the argument, and I think I'll get into this a little bit, is that the kind of capitalism is also the realization of bourgeois society in the 19th century. I really think that there's something to that, and something that I've only kind of come to grips with lately. It's thinking about how it's not just a despoiling of the potential, but it really is a kind of fulfillment, and the division of labor, say the kind of scientific revolutions that you get in, say, the second industrial revolution, it's a very destructive and powerful force, but it also seems to really kind of still is critiqued, and not just critiqued by Marxists, but kind of critiqued by society on the basis of bourgeois rights. So that it's very much like all the things that people are concerned with and upset about, say about the second industrial revolution, say, for example, we're Australians, the treatment of Aboriginals. On what basis is that a problem? Well, it's precisely on the basis of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or life, liberty, and property, that they've been excluded from that, being able to participate in it. That's what's controversial about it. Even people that kind of would hate all the stuff I'm saying today, and would call all these people like, straight white men or whatever. There's a thing in this, young people, I don't know if it's still around, but a few years ago there was something called the Warriors of the Aboriginal Resistance War. And they were a kind of millennial activist group that set up, and their manifesto, they said, look, Aboriginals, they've been colonized, they're not, and they want to have their own society, they want to go back to their traditional society, their life, liberty, and property. That's not traditional society. Sorry, you're doing a Lockean critique. You're being a good bourgeois subject there. Even people pulling down Thomas Jefferson statues and the George Floyd protests and that. I think if Thomas Jefferson could see that, he might say in the immortal words of Mariah Carey, "Why are you so obsessed with me?" Really. So it's a haunting thing that comes back again and again. And in fact, we'll get into how the bourgeois revolution is something that replays itself, particularly on the left, and not just the bourgeois revolutions, but what I'll round out with, which is, 1848, which is the kind of really elaborate, really clarifies the political task, the changing political task in the 19th century. So, just to clarify about the pursuit of happiness quickly, and Benjamin Constant does round out his liberty of the ancients versus liberty of the moderns with Constant isn't renouncing political liberty, right, in favor of, say, an empty pursuit of leisure and a freedom from politics. He was rather attempting to situate the social content, or what ought to be the social content of modern political liberty, that is, individual liberty, civil rights. This helps us to understand the 19th century in perhaps a different way than is common on the left. The crisis of bourgeois society in the 19th century was not, as is vulgarly understood, a changing of the guard of the ruling class, as I said, nor was it merely the sorcerer's apprentice image we get from Marx. It wasn't just a despoiling of the potentials of the society of free labour, but it was in fact concurrently its realization and crisis. It's kind of stuck in a transition. It wants to push beyond itself, but it gets stuck, and it seems to demand a particular political task. So, importantly, this self-contradiction was not merely an objective tendency any more than mass unemployment was. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, in his philosophy of poverty, had explored the ways, in the 1840s, in which the rising class struggle of the working class was causing an economic and political crisis, which had led Proudhon to give a kind of pessimistic appraisal of the political strivings of the working class. Marx critiqued Proudhon for underestimating the dynamism unleashed by the workers' movement as a constituent element within capitalist development. As Marx wrote in his Poverty of Philosophy, which really ruined his friendship with Proudhon, unfortunately, but before that, Marx does credit himself with these people they're working together in the 1840s, and he said, I kind of intoxicated him with Hegel. I Hegel-pilled him or whatever, and that these people are talking and chit-chatting and having long conversations into the night. It's interesting to think about. I think we play the Young Marx movie, and it's worth a look because it does kind of show you how they are sitting around smoking and drinking coffee and talking about these things. Marx critiques Proudhon for underestimating the dynamism unleashed by the workers' movement as a constituent element within capitalist development. And yeah, I've said that. And to quote Marx here, he says, "In England, strikes have regularly given rise to the invention of and application of new machines. Machines were, it may be said, the weapon employed by the capitalists to quell the revolt of specialized labor. The self-acting mule, the greatest invention in modern industry, put out of action the spinners who were in revolt. And yet, as society was alienated from this process, this potential made not work." This is kind of from Horkheimer later on. He said, this potential made not work, but the work is superfluous, as Marx would later write in his preparatory notes for Das Kapital, and forgive me for the long quote, but it's great, from the Grundrisse. Capital itself, and it really gets into how it's a kind of fulfillment of bourgeois society while also being its kind of, at the same time, its negation. Capital itself is the moving contradiction in that it presses to reduce labor time to a minimum, while it posits labor time on the other side as a sole measure and source of wealth. Hence it diminishes labor time in the necessary form so as to increase it in the superfluous form. Hence posit the superfluous in a growing measure as a condition, a question of life or death for the necessary. On the one side, it calls into life all the powers of science and of nature, as of social combination and of social intercourse, in order to make the creation of wealth independent, relatively, of the labor time employed on it. On the other side, it wants to use labor time as a measuring rod for the giant social forces thereby created, and to confine them within the limits required to maintain the already created value as value. Forces of production and social relations, two different sides of the development of the social individual, appear to capital as mere means, and are merely means for it to produce on its limited foundation. Now, many have taken Marx's famous fragment of machines here as a recipe for, or prediction of, capitalist breakdown and collapse, and yet it is precisely the limited foundation that is reproduced through crisis. Not just the limited foundation of production, but of society in its totality, including politically. Indeed, what goes missing with the kind of preoccupation with Marx's Das Kapital as descriptive, or as a polemic leveled against bourgeois political economy, is the problem of politics. I wonder, really, and it might be something that we can discuss a little bit, I'm interested in the Zoomer left, and I wonder if they're going to maintain there was quite an interest in Das Kapital with the millennials, and I wonder if that's going to continue on, or people are going to still be reading Das Kapital, or have they kind of moved more into other things, like seems like there's a shift towards focusing on national liberation struggles and wanting to talk about the 20th century as a kind of progress in Marxism and things like that, which is all interesting. I just wonder, I'm saying things here, I hope I'm still talking to someone. There was a preoccupation with Das Kapital, at least. So Marx used the example of what happened in France in the wake of the abortive 1848 revolution, when Bonaparte took the revolutionary initiative against the forces of reaction that sought to suppress the rising influence of the working class. He immediately legitimized his rule through returning to the source of his power, democracy, or the people themselves. Marx saw Bonaparte, and this is, Napoleon's nephew, right? Bonaparte III. Marx saw Bonaparte as neither inevitable or accidental. The progressive character of Bonaparte, himself a utopian socialist, was in his stripping the entire state machinery of its halo. In doing so, he deputized society to discipline itself to its own crisis. So, again, that's a kind of weird inverted image of what Kant wanted. Society to kind of discipline itself, to take responsibility for itself. Now there's a kind of authoritarian character to that. This essentially incorporated the superfluous quality of the workers as an integral part of the capitalist state, which henceforth would maintain a permanent occupation of society through the standing army, welfare, and police. But again, as always with Marx, he saw this not as the end of the story, but as an inverted image of untapped necessity, particularly a political necessity that kind of emerges through his understanding of the 1848 revolution and its failure. Here, unlike the bourgeois revolution for Marx, this is kind of the lesson he's kind of thinking through. The bourgeois revolution, as we said, the political revolution came at the end. Now, it would seem that the political revolution was to precede and lay the grounds for the workers to pursue socialism. So the social revolution will come after. How do these questions pose themselves today? Well, this question could be addressed in a number of ways, and I kind of have a little thing for myself here, kind of giving myself a choice. I can be nice or I can be nasty. And I'm going to be nasty just because the tram tracks were flooded. So there's a number of ways you could deal with it, really. You could deal with it in a number of the question of how Marxism appears today. And of course, it's spontaneously reproduced by young people reaching for it on the bookshelf, and people, they're interested in this kind of controversial topic. But there were, of course, radical alternatives to socialism proposed during Marx's time. Perhaps they have a stronger purchase today in a world that once again appears natural and inevitable. With that in mind, and remembering the Adam Smith quote I started with, I'll finish with an Engels quote from 1843, where he addresses something called the Book of Murder, which was a pamphlet written by someone called Marcus. There is a suggestion that it was kind of used in a polemical way by the Chartists to kind of see that there is a kind of antisocial suppression of the workers, precisely as an affront to what Adam Smith lays out here with the multiplication of the human species, and the superfluous character of the working class has thrown that into crisis. In New Holland, so that's the old name for Australia as we know, this is Engels in 1843, with a population density of 1 per square mile, the savages suffer just as much from overpopulation as England. In short, if we want to be consistent with new popular theories of overpopulation, we must admit that the earth was already overpopulated when only one man existed. The implications of this line of thought are that since it is precisely the poor who are superfluous, nothing should be done for them except to make their dying of starvation as easy as possible, and to convince them that it cannot be helped and that there is no other salvation for the whole class than to keep propagation down to the absolute minimum. Or if this proves impossible, then it is, after all, better to establish a state institution for the painless killing of the children of the poor, such as this anonymous Marxist Marcus has suggested, whereby each working class family would be allowed to have 2.5 children, any excess being painlessly killed. Now, that's me being nasty at the end. Is that how capitalism appears today? If it's totally, thoroughly, reified, totally naturalized, and if the left doesn't have a utopian aspect to it, I mean, that would be a strange kind of end of the road of the millennial left to end up with something like that. Now, I do know that AOC maybe not the great shining example of millennial leftism, but she did say, people should do the responsible thing and not have children. So it is capitalism still plaguing the way we think about the present, still plaguing the way, even bourgeois kind of politics today, capitalist politics, is still plagued by questions raised, I think, in the Industrial Revolution. Hillary Clinton says she's kept awake at night by unemployment. Now, it's a curious thing to think, as I said, that it wasn't an objective tendency. As Proudhon noted, the workers' actual self-activity was affecting the way capitalism was developing, was affecting the way politics was developing. So if there is no class struggle today, then how do we recognize capitalism? And how is, the dynamism of capitalism, is it still kind of as operant as it might be? If there was a rebirth of the left and a kind of reinvigoration of the class struggle, would that affect the way that society develops? Even it might, if Marx and Proudhon and that are correct, it might actually affect the way that the historical dynamism of capitalism unfolds, especially if we're thinking about thinking on some of the kind of utopian, kind of techno-utopian dreams of the utopian socialists. those kind of ideas might come back again or something like that. Who knows? But I'm just spitballing a little bit here. That's the end of my prepared notes, but I wondered if anyone had any questions that they wanted to get into. Any thoughts?
When you say there is no class struggle, what do you mean?
I mean, well, it depends what you mean by class struggle, I guess. I mean, you could say that there are people doing collective bargaining still. I mean, even to a limited extent. Even that is a little lower than what it has been, I guess, in the neoliberal period. Maybe it'll come back, there'll be a reboom in collective bargaining. I don't think that is the same as class struggle for Marxism. Marxism and Proudhon and Marx in the 1840s could take for granted something that we couldn't, which was the politicization of the working class through not just the crisis of society, but through kind of socialist ideologues, and that had the combination of the workers and the intellectuals was a kind of living reality. There were, Proudhon was very famous, much more famous than Marx. And he was a proletarian kind of intellectual himself, and he had a great purchase and he'd be giving speeches on the streets, and people would come to hear him talk, and there was an infusion of what people used to call class consciousness that I don't think exists in the same way today. So, by the metric of comparing the kind of class struggle of the 19th century to what we have today, that's what I mean. What do you think? Does that address it?
Yeah, mostly. I would certainly agree that class consciousness is all but gone, and the class struggle is very much diminished, but I wouldn't say that means it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I hate to put it in a maybe kind of pithy, dogmatic way, but Rosa Luxemburg herself said that workers are revolutionary or they're nothing. And I mean, I don't know. I don't want to get lost in semantics and terminology. I'm just trying to talk about how there really does seem a yawning gap between what they could take for granted and what we can take for granted. And I think we face very peculiar problems, different problems, to Marx and Proudhon and that. They're not necessarily, I'm not saying it's the end of the road by any means, but I'm just saying I think there needs to be a hell of a lot of, I don't know what there needs to be. I mean, Platypus isn't a political organization, I'll say that much. I'm just here to kind of pose this historical problematic, really.
Developing it a bit further, is there something about like a depoliticized union militancy in terms of the subjective aspect of class consciousness when it comes to capitalism and its potential transformation? Is that what you're hinting towards, or something to be raised?
Well, maybe. I mean, I feel like maybe what you're getting into there a little bit is the prices and incomes accord or something like that. There's a lot of buyer's remorse, I guess, about what happened for an international audience, people that might not know it. The prices and incomes accord is basically a kind of social contract, if you like, between the union movement and the Labour Party, between the Labour movement and the state, basically, that gave certain guarantees like, superannuation, a living wage, basically the idea of a living wage in return for a kind of a dampening down of Labour militancy. Now, there's a kind of buyer's remorse, I guess, and there's a big rhetoric around and a story around political betrayal. We were betrayed by our leaders. We were betrayed. And people talk like that all the time. Now, maybe, I don't know exactly, but we should also note that there are objective kind of changes in capitalism that emerge after the kind of 70s downturn that influenced the way that society is kind of organically organizing. There's no real impediment to workers joining unions today. I could join a union. I have been in a union. I'm not in at the moment. I work in an industry where it's masses of people on site. I work in the transport and logistics industry, and there's hundreds of people on site at any given time. And if there's a public holiday, the whole thing goes. There could be a hell of a lot of, and I know during lockdowns and COVID and stuff, there were people, Socialist Alternative said, why don't the workers hold society to ransom? That was a kind of first initial impulse before the kind of support of the lockdowns. There was this brief moment where they were like, well, all the workers that are being forced to work should not go to work. And they could, but if that just kind of happened overnight, today, right now, if something like that happened, people would quite, I think, well within their rights to say, well, this is just kind of gangsterism. This is just the criminality or something, and they should be forced to work or something like that. Because there hasn't been like a kind of a build-up of a kind of rebuilding of the labor movement. There's kind of things that maybe would have to happen as a kind of long process that would involve things like it would involve a society, it would affect society in a way that it's hard to imagine, it's hard to describe really. And if we're thinking about the way it affected society in the past. But yeah, I don't know. Is that kind of, were you kind of getting at like the labor militancy in that way?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, I don't know. I have people all the time saying, oh, Johnny, how come you're not more excited about the CFMEU protests and things like that? And it seems like there is no obstacle to, like I was saying, to people joining unions. The question would be, why don't they? Why don't the workers want to join unions? Is it just because they are they're brainwashed by the capitalist media or something? Or they're acting against their own self-interest or something? I'm not so sure that's why that's happening. I think it is to do with changes in capitalism. I mean, there's a difference obviously between socialism and the labor movement too, which I'd have to be careful about. They were historically bound up together, but also socialism was kind of like a clearinghouse for, if you had a problem, the socialist parties were like, if you had a problem in capitalism, whether you're a worker or not, if you're oppressed in whatever way, we're going to be the grounds for that to be politicized. And Lenin talks about this in What Is to Be Done. He says, any oppression, any scandalous oppression in society is grounds for kind of organizing around the issue of, and politicizing it towards the issue of capitalism. Yeah, I don't know if I've helped to answer your question, really. Any more questions? How long have we been going here? You guys, we need some more questions, I think.
I've got one more. You've spoken, it's interesting that the title of the talk is Capital in History, the Relevance of Marxism Today. You spoke a lot of John and Kant, which, isn't that common amongst the Marxist left, from what I've encountered. My reading of Kant is that he was thinking politics philosophically, like the modern subject in its capacity for reason, collective subject. Is that similar or different to Marx and Marxism? is Marx and Marxism thinking politics philosophically? And if so, how? Or in what other way is Kant important to, may Kant be important to Marxism, that was emphasised in Platypus?
That's a really good question. It's a good one. Because it could be a question of, like, to what extent is Marxism philosophy really at all? Is he doing a philosophy? Or I don't think so. I think he really is taking up the kind of the crisis of, say, the Hegelian dialectic, I guess, which I don't want to get into why people prefer Hegel over Kant or whatever, but he's taking up the bourgeois dialectic in its crisis. So I did say, reading the bourgeois radicals, I said in my talk, we might infer a kind of complete indifference to the precise form of the sovereign. And people will say, what's going on? How can you think these people are progressive? They're Voltaire's swanning around with like absolute monarchs and things like that. And it's like, well, they are dealing on a level of abstraction from politics. I think Kant, and Hegel, they are not directly involved in politics in a way that someone like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and the bourgeois radicals are, right? So to hold them to account for the responsibility for, say, the French Revolution and its excesses or something like that would be a kind of a problematic claim. I know Benjamin Constant, who I mentioned here, he does say Rousseau was taken up one-sidedly in the French Revolution, and that was a problem for the French Revolution, but he says, I don't put that at the feet of Rousseau. So I think the idea of theory and practice is a curious one. I'm kind of aware here that I'm maybe skirting your question a little bit. I mean, I think the idea of practice that Kant in particular kind of points towards our ability to make and remake ourselves in the world, I think is an important way of thinking for Marx, and something that kind of takes for granted a lot of the time. So if I've been a bit perhaps heavy-handed in that aspect, it's only because I think that there's a neglect of and even an aversion to the Enlightenment tradition that has kind of emerged on the left.
As you said in the beginning, like, if Marx isn't a philosopher and the bourgeois radicals were philosophers, or at least some of them were philosophers, why? Like, what's the difference between why is Marx not a philosopher? What's the change in the relation of politics to philosophy from that period?
Yeah, it's a curious one. I think it's a problem. I'm no expert on philosophy, I'll say that much. I've learned about philosophy through Platypus. But you could use a cheap answer. A cheap answer would be, well, Marx is a kind of political actor. Well, that sounds a little cheap. That's using the Feuerbach, his thesis on Feuerbach, and saying, well, the point is not to philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. But I think there is something to Marx's critique of Feuerbach that might be helpful here, actually, insofar as the changing task of society, the changing task of a frozen revolution, the frozen revolution at a standstill, the bourgeois revolution kind of grinds to a halt. In the 19th century, it's not so much about Marx as an activist or Marx as a political agent. That's not the difference, I don't think. I think the difference is that, is it even possible to build on the kind of bourgeois philosophical tradition in the 19th century in a way that Hegel and Kant and these figures of the high Enlightenment could take for granted. The high Enlightenment, what does that mean? Well, it's a culmination of thought, of revolutionary thought, the epochal transformation, the revolution of society, which is built up, and they're taking that whole past and they're able to kind of say, well, that the whole of history seems to be leading up to them now. The whole of history seems to be leading up to a more perfect society, that we can kind of perfect ourselves and a limitless potential can be unleashed. The 19th century is different insofar as there's still that potential there, that's still kind of plaguing the historical actors, still bourgeois politics, and yet it's also the capitalist state, which is new, which poses the problem in a kind of completely different way, where the political revolution is going to have to come before the social transformation of society. So I'm not saying philosophy is no longer possible, but rather there is a sense in which, say, I think you can understand this, okay, one way of kind of getting at this is the way in which philosophy becomes like a kind of separated, reified practice that emerges in the 19th century as very distinct from something like science and philosophy, and then there's kind of anthropology, then there's kind of the study of man. Now we're in a world where it's just like, you read evolutionary biology and things like that, where it's like human beings are kind of meat puppets for a kind of for their genes or something like that, which is crazy barbaric compared to what we get from Kant. Perhaps the answer would be that it wasn't the task for Marx to make the world philosophical. I know that he writes that, but in his kind of evolving self-understanding, there is a sense in which bourgeois society points beyond itself per se. The endless kind of becoming of bourgeois society, the becoming, there is a sense in which communism, the spectre of communism, would be, at least the way they understood it, would be world history for the first time. Like it would be world history anew, and it would be the overcoming and the end of philosophy. I mean, Chris Catrone, you guys check out Chris Catrone on the ends of philosophy. He addresses his problem in a much thorougher way than I possibly can give it here. But he has if you look up Chris Catrone, Platypus Affiliated Society, the ends of philosophy, and he talks about through people like Karl Korsch and Lukács and stuff, the idea about the supersession of the bourgeois dialectic. Engels writes about it too, where he says, well, once man has kind of solved the final kind of contradiction of society, he's faced with a kind of another one, which is like related, I think, to the abolition of labor. Man is still going to metabolize the world. There's still going to be work in communism. So the difference between work and labor might be one way of thinking about it. But what kind of social totality are these people going to be living in? Are they going to be writing philosophy? Are they going to be invading the stars like Star Trek? Or are they going to be floating on their back and looking at the stars? And who knows? I mean, it's not for us to say, but that is the speculative proposition that Marx faced, which was a new social totality that would, yes, it would be marked with the birth pangs of capitalism in its crisis, right? Be marked with the birth pangs of, say, bourgeois society, in the crisis in capitalism. still have the bourgeois state, Lenin says for a little bit, into socialism. But the idea is that would wither away, and that it'd be it's not the end of history, but it would be the kind of beginning of history, it'd be something as profound as, the bourgeois epoch or the Neolithic revolution. Mankind suddenly, the average human type, like Trotsky says, human type, it doesn't even say human being anymore. The average human type would rise to the level of a Aristotle or a Mozart or something. So I think I've got there eventually. It's a tricky one. I'm not trained in philosophy, so it's a tricky one for me to think about. Really, it's like fucking the cogs really they just. But I think I got there in the end. I think I addressed it at least a little bit. Any more questions?
Surely, Haynes. Usually have something interesting to say.
No. I'm very content. I have a question. I have two questions actually. I hope they're interrelated, then maybe distantly related, but I think somewhat they're tied to each other. So you brought up the Hegel quote, like the happy periods are blank pages in history, so that this grand historical development seems to happen when history is like a slaughter bench, right, or something to this effect. And I think part of the effect of the failure of socialism and like the spectre of Stalinism, but also the experience of Nazism and these kinds of things, is that the idea of history now seems terrifying, right? Like that you would say, there's the promised land over there, and we're going to start this process of going there. It just seems to justify atrocities. So that would be like the conservative critique of the Japanese and Marxism. But I feel like today is actually like maybe more people believe in it than they would say. Like it actually does undergird a big fear of revolution, even amongst leftists. It's like maybe unacknowledged in a certain way. So I wonder how you would address like why is someone like Lenin not just say like a religious terrorist in their advocation for doing what's necessary to reach this next historical stage? Like why is revolution not the kind of violent picture that we might have of it? And why is like the proposition of world history not maybe what we think it is, or what we feel it is given the experience of the 20th century. So that's the first question. And then the second question, which I'm throwing a lot at you, but is one could imagine the entire historical narrative you've given, and then saying what's necessary is, like there's a variety of kind of political, intellectual, cultural projects that could flow from that narrative that you've laid out. And yet, in Platypus, we're saying, well, we actually have to engage with the dead left, and we have to host panels, and we have to have interviews, and it's like, so there's this necessary task of hosting the conversation, but how does that actually relate? What is the relation between that narrative of history, the bourgeois revolution, industrialization, and the failure of the left? What is the connection between that historical narrative and hosting the conversation? And so I guess tied into that question is like, what does it actually mean to say that the left is dead? Right? Because I think when a lot of people hear that, it's just kind of like, the left is bad, the left has bad ideas, the left is stupid. Like there's a lot of, what are we actually saying? And we're saying that the left is dead, and why are we tasked with engaging with that and raising that problem?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a few different layers, of course, to what you're saying, and you have thrown a bit at me there. I'll start, first of all, with this idea of the grand narrative of history being distrusted, and that's not new. I mean, you could say that is the kind of post-political left, or postmodernism as well. There's a distrust of the kind of grand narrative of history. I said it in my teaching the other day. I said, we're kind of saddled with the question, whose truth? Whose truth are we talking about? Why isn't, as you said, Lenin just a religious figure? Well, he is. In a way, it's true. Marxism has become like a religion, and it has its either happy or sad adherents. But we're here as an educational organization to kind of go through all this scattered remnants of Marxism that people pick up and try and explain them to ourselves, and in doing so explain them to young people and try and at least have some semblance of what these people in the history meant and how they thought about themselves in the historical moment. Is that fear of revolution, though? I'm not so sure if I don't know exactly what you're getting at, but I'd say, you know.
Well, it's like the image of revolution is, when you think of revolution, you just think of violence.
Right.
Automatically, you know. And so, like, when you talk to most people, most ordinary people, I think if you bring up the topic of revolution, it's like automatically this image, kind of the Jacobin terror or something.
Mm-hmm.
Like that actually this is just going to be, it's going to have like noble goals, and then it's going to lead to a bunch of violence, and it's kind of like idealistic. Like, I think that is just a pervasive image of revolution, and that is a consequence of the failure of Marxism.
It's a good one, because of course you could just say that society is already that. Society is already a failed revolution that's extremely violent. Extremely violent. And there's a hell of a lot of violent things that maintains our everyday social relations. That's what, not necessarily just wars overseas or something like that, but that just the police have a standing occupation of, the state has a standing occupation of society as just a normal function. As I said, the superfluity of the workers is integrated into the state after 1848. But there is a sense, I think what you're getting at here, I get what you're getting at now, is like, someone like Adam Curtis, who's like a kind of conservative filmmaker, liberal conservative, whatever, he says people are distrustful of revolution in that way. They say, well, look what happened last time. Look what happened last time when a bunch of people got swept up in a big idea. But of course, the kind of control that people think exists isn't really possible. To put it in the Jeff Goldblum thing from Jurassic Park, life finds a way. The bourgeois revolution can't be kind of stopped. In a sense, like lockdowns, when we think about this in a kind of funny way, insofar as you could suppress society kind of totally, shut it down, and yet people would risk life and limb and huge fines to even just maintain being able to go to church and seeing each other. They're not even like, doing politics, but they're still kind of trying to reconstitute, I guess, petty bourgeois civil society. But I think don't really have any answers for you, because of course you're right. As soon as you say anything to an average person about Marxism or socialism or Lenin in particular, a very controversial figure, they think of violence. But of course Lenin is a great one for this, because his whole political maturity comes out of being the younger brother of a Narodnik who had attempted to assassinate the Tsar. And Lenin had a big part of his political maturity was a criticism of terrorism. Terrorism meant something different back then, but it still is the kind of petty bourgeois hysterics, if you like, trying to shock people out of their complacency, wake them up to the deprivations of everyday life or something like that. So I think that's a good problematic. And it's a lot of people say, well, you can't even use the word socialism. I know there's a big movement seems to be, well, not a big movement, there seems to be every now and then people will be like, what about a Labour Party in America? America's never had a Labour Party. Let's have a Labour Party in America. And it's just like, well, it depends what you mean. Well, again, let's not get into semantics. I mean, what's the actual social content of what you're talking about? It might be an interesting experiment, but it depends on what you're talking about. Are you talking about orienting around the existing Labour movement? Are you talking about a socialist party? So those questions, I think someone's going to address the problem of the revolutionary quality of our society, the fact that we still kind of live in a revolutionary society. Someone's going to take that up, whether it's Donald Trump or whatever. Someone's going to take it. And we are living through a period of transition. The reason why we're even asking a lot of these questions is that neoliberalism is in kind of crisis and transition to something else. So I said on the other teaching that I did, we live in a pre-political moment. Well, maybe it's also, you've got to think about it as kind of post-political, that we live in a long kind of a long time coming post-politics, actually. Now, in terms of, I think I addressed it a little bit, but just to make it a bit more clear what we can get out of hosting the conversation on the left and the dead left. If it's dead, then why do we want to hear from it? Well, what do we don't mean that these people are useless or that they're stupid or anything like that, or that we know better. We're here to learn from the left and learn from their historical experience, because there's nothing good about the left being dead. We're not here to revel in its deadness. We want ultimately the reconstitution of a kind of Marxist left, we're raising the possibility of that unlikely but not impossible task. So Platypus is very much just one little segment of that problem. We're only addressing it in a very limited way. We're not an activist group, we're not a political organization. We're just here to investigate the kind of symptomology that we've inherited from the new and old left. These kind of things that kind of spontaneously, I'd say, get picked up by young people, these kind of ideas. Does that help?
Yeah, well, I guess, let me ask this another way. Like, if you went to a panel with leftists and you didn't have this historical narrative, so you're going to a Platypus panel and you have this historical narrative, like what different experience are we trying to cultivate? Like, what is the relation between the historical situatedness, which we try to put the panel in, and compared to just any other, because obviously other people organise panels, or other people can organise panels, but how much that happens is, I guess, a question. But I guess, like, I'm trying to just get at what's the distinctive experience of hosting a conversation, how does that relate to capital and history, per se?
It's funny, remember Leo Panitch? He passed away. And in Platypus, we said, we got him through the panel prompt, we got him to reread, it was about historical Marxism, one of the panel, and we got him to reread Rosa Luxemburg's Reform and Revolution. And he said, well, I haven't read this really for decades, but on reading it again, I disagree with a hell of a lot of this. So that kind of thing, that examining the distance, and maybe you should, I don't know, but I'm just saying, examining the distance between historical Marxism and the present, we are there to kind of put our finger on that wound. And maybe Marxism, like the whole panel prompt today is what is the use of Marxism. Maybe it's of no use, and I want to be here to raise that potential too, or maybe we need to go beyond Marxism. But in going beyond Marxism, we don't want to fall below the kind of grand horizon of possibility that it seemed to raise at the start of the 20th century and the late 19th century, in particular at that high watermark of second international Marxism and stuff. And it's even through its crisis, you know, the crisis of second international Marxism really was a function of its success. So not only can we work through the symptomatic kind of detritus and all that sort of thing, but we might be, maybe, who knows, I don't know, but one day down the line, I don't know how many years from now, maybe not very long, people will be looking at Platypus panels and looking through things and trying to understand the present precisely on the historical record we've helped to curate, particularly the record of the millennial left, which is something that I really want to get into. We should organize some stuff teaching around the millennial left and the different phases of the millennial left, because they neglect recording their own history, which is a funny thing, because I think part of it is they're afraid to face up to their own failure. And it's hard to tell how serious a lot of the say, online Zoomer communists are. Are they just trolling the millennials as a function of the millennials not actually facing up to their own failures? Is that a kind of necessary, that's a kind of necessary excrescence of our failure to kind of come to terms with failure? So I don't know. Again, this historical narrative isn't, we're not conjuring it from thin air. You know, you can read, it's only really, a funny thing about a lot of the stuff I've said here today is that it's only kind of Marxists who dispute a lot of what I've laid out here because of this idea of a succession of modes of production, right? There's modes of production that give way to each other. The German ideology, people rely on that a lot. Marx's German ideology, great book. I'm not giving it shit, but that it's only it's a curious thing to try and deny the significance of the bourgeois revolutions for historical Marxism. That's a strange inheritance that we have to work through, and it's kind of relatively new, I'd say. I'd say even reading, you know, new leftist stuff that millennials have used and even the kind of post-political leftists use, say, something that I referenced, I'm from McQueen's in New Britannia, or talking to those Red Eureka guys, those Maoist guys that we've interviewed, they're like, oh yeah, the bourgeois revolution, absolutely. We're in the tradition of Oliver Cromwell and Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, we're consciously taking up that. Whereas I think it comes kind of later through the kind of post-political left and a kind of ambivalence, particularly around the millennials. You see it. The kind of settler colonial discourse would be one example of like a way in which that whole thing gets shafted. It's just all that potential, you know, if they say the American Revolution seen as a slaveholders' revolt or something. It is a inheritance of the new left that we're working through, but at the same time, I think even the new left were much less ambivalent about embracing that legacy, I think. So it's something that's relatively new. I'm not sure if it's going to last forever. But that's just one aspect of what I tried to express today, really. Because we can wow young people with this kind of bourgeois revolutionary stuff, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge that the task has changed, and that's what I tried to get into very briefly at the end there with 1848 and Bonapartism, and how I said, you know, the police maintain the state maintains a kind of a standing occupation of society. I think that's a good way of saying it. So the task has changed. So anyway, I think that addresses the question a little bit. Does it help?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any other thoughts? How long have we been here? An hour and a half. happy to answer any other questions, but if not, we can wrap it up.
Let's do it.
That's it. All right. Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming and.